Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about George Washington's presidency and the beginning of the new American government following the ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and 1789. There's plenty to talk about with regards to George Washington, a lot more than could comfortably fit in one flipped video. So today's video is going to focus primarily on the domestic policies of the Washington administration and how Congress and the executive branch strengthened the government in its infancy. So, with that in mind, let's get started. George Washington took office on April 30th, 1789, when he was sworn in at Federal Hall in New York City. He was elected pretty much unanimously, had some token opposition, but nothing too terribly serious. The first controversy of Washington's presidency happened almost immediately when an argument broke out within the government about what the president should be called. Of course, we call the president today simply Mr. President, if you're addressing him directly. There were a lot of people who thought that the office of president deserved a bit more respect and should have a more resplendent title than that. This was led by John Adams, the vice president, who thought that the president should command a lot more respect, and the title should reflect that. So some of the titles Adams suggested were His Excellency, His Highness, His Mightiness, His Most Benign Highness, His Elective Highness, His Majesty, His Highness President of the United States, and Protector of Her Liberties is probably my favorite one. But again, Congress decided simply it should be Mr. President. There were some more sarcastic members of Congress who, behind his back, called Adams his rotundity the Duke of Braintree, referring to the small town in Massachusetts that he is from. Now, a lot of people, Thomas Jefferson among them, thought this was the most ridiculous thing in the world to be arguing about. But at the same time, it's sort of important because precedents were being set, and the decisions that were made in the first couple of years we're going to affect the timber and the operation of the government for many, many years to come. So that's kind of worth remembering. Later in 1789, Washington named his first cabinet after the posts were established by Congress. The first four cabinet departments were the Secretary of State, or Department of State, I should say, Department of the Treasury, Department of War, and then the Office of Attorney General, which is basically the council for the government. The first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, having served many years as the U.S. Ambassador to France. He was very good in foreign policy. Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, who had been a member of the Confederation Congress from New York, and had also been one of George Washington's top aides during the Revolutionary War as a young man. Secretary of War was Henry Knox, the American general from the Revolutionary War, most famous for helping take Fort Ticonderoga and then moving all of the supplies down to Boston to help with the siege there. And then the Attorney General was Edmund Randolph, who, if I'm not mistaken, served very briefly as governor of Virginia before the Constitution was ratified. These posts are out of congressional control. So there's some separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and the cabinet has the ability to enforce laws and set policy within its own sphere. So that's very important, giving more power to the executive and having less power in the hands of Congress in some matters, as it was under the Articles of Confederation. Also in 1789, Congress passed the Judiciary Act, which set up the federal judicial and court system. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution simply lays out that there should be a federal judiciary consisting of a Supreme Court and inferior courts, however Congress wants to establish those. So there's really no blueprint in the Constitution for what the court system should look like. The Judiciary Act of 1789 lays that out. The first Supreme Court had 6 justices. It had 3 appeals courts spread throughout the young country, and then 13 district courts, which was 1 court per state, and they would hear cases pertaining to federal law. It's important to remember, especially if you're one of my students who took AP Government, as of 1789, the Supreme Court was not intended to be the arbiter of what is and is not constitutional. It was just a final court of appeal, and it wasn't until the early 1800s with John Marshall and Marbury versus Madison that the Supreme Court begins to assume the role that it's most known for today. The government also began to establish a financial system to prop up the new nation to make sure it would not go bankrupt or become too heavily reliant on foreign aid. This is a time when America is still trying to establish itself as being independent, as not having to rely on other outside parties, so not having to take any kind of foreign assistance or become entangled or entwined in foreign alliances is an important thing for them. Most of the work in setting up the nation's new financial system fell to the Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. Washington was not a confrontational person. He didn't like confrontation. He saw the office of the president as being above political discussions and debates. But Hamilton, as Washington's trusted aide during the Revolution and for years before this, sort of served as his enforcer and his bad cop in the new government. And of course, Hamilton can't be president. He was born in the Caribbean and he lost duels, but he wielded a great deal of power during this time when he was setting up the country's financial system. There was some national debt in the early 1790s. It was divided out like this. The U.S. owed about $11 million to foreign nations for their aid during the Revolutionary War. That's mostly France, as you can imagine. They owed about $24 million to people domestically who had supplied resources for the war. Also, the state governments collectively, altogether, owed about $23 million to, again, people who had supplied war resources. Hamilton's plan was for the federal government to take on all of the state government's debts and create one big national debt. And under this plan, the government would issue securities to wealthy creditors and get loans, essentially, and then they would pay them back down the road with interest. And this would establish a permanent debt. And it would also recruit or entice wealthy financiers who would be loyal to the government and who would loan the government money, and the federal government had the leverage of saying, we will pay you back. We're giving you the security here. We're good for it, right? This greatly upset the Southerners, who had mostly paid off their war debt and didn't understand why, the federal government's money should, that was coming in part from them, should be going to paying off the war debts of other states. And we'll talk about how that was resolved here in just a second. The government also needed a bank to coin money and to back money. And by backing money, I mean that the federal government says, this money is worth something. Okay, it has the full faith and credit of the United States behind it. And the First National Bank was established in 1791 with a 20-year charter. How to fund the national debt, how to pay people back, that was going to have to be done with taxes. And there's no income tax at this time. So taxes took the form of excises on goods. So examples of goods that were taxed are wine, tea, coffee, and liquor. And the most common of the liquor taxes was the tax on whiskey, which was by far the most popular drink in the new country at this time. So again, the Southerners don't want to go along with this. They saw it as wealthy Northerners, these financiers, these bankers in cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston, wielding too much control at the expense of the Southern states that were more rural and didn't have these big financial bigwigs. So the compromise was reached to put the permanent capital of the United States, when it was finally built, in the South somewhere, and that was supposed to kind of appease the Southerners like Jefferson and James Madison, who were afraid the North would get too much political power. There is perhaps no better example of how the federal government was able to establish its authority during Washington's administration than the Whiskey Rebellion. As I said in the previous slide, whiskey was the most popular drink in America at the time. Farmers, especially on the frontier, would take their surplus corn and turn it into whiskey, and it was so ubiquitous. Whiskey could be found everywhere, to such a degree that some rural farmers, lacking other currency, would use whiskey as a medium of exchange. Basically, they would use whiskey as money. And so when the federal government begins taxing it, that greatly angers these frontier farmers. They feel underrepresented, they feel exploited by the wealthy people in the country, and they begin to drudge up the old battle cry, no taxation without representation, saying that they were underrepresented in government and therefore they shouldn't have to abide by this tax. And it came to the point where they began refusing to pay it, and they were harassing tax collectors and impeding them from doing their job in these areas. And the federal government threw its threw the gauntlet down and said, no, like, you absolutely cannot do this. No taxation without representation. Like in the time before the Revolutionary War, we're talking about taxes that are passed by a foreign body 4,000 miles away that we shouldn't have to abide by. These laws, these taxes, are passed by elected representatives within our own borders. It's the law of the land. You gotta pay them. And to prove their point, when the rebels wouldn't calm down, wouldn't stop, a militia of 13,000 men was raised in Pennsylvania. George Washington went to Pennsylvania and rode at the head of the militia towards the rebels, and they found out George Washington and a bunch of soldiers were coming, ready to give them what for, and the rebels just went home, and no shot was fired. So it diffused. It wasn't really all that exciting. It was really pretty anticlimactic. But the most important thing about the Whiskey Rebellion is it proves that the government can enforce its own laws within its own borders, and that it will use force if it has to. And that's a very important precedent that the government set at that time. That's going to do it for today. Make sure to refer to your book if you have any questions, or ask in class if you're one of my students. And we will talk in class about the foreign policy of the United States during the 1790s. Cheers.